let's talk about mansions. St. Teresa's mansions. I am Father Mark Mary with the Franciscan Friars of the Renewal, and this is Ascension Presents. I've been on this kick, and it has been extremely helpful for my spiritual life, working through a little book by Ignatius Press, and it's not a little book at all. It's called right here, Fire Within, and it's Father Thomas Dubé. He's one of my favorite spiritual writers, talking about St. Teresa of Ávila, St. John of the Cross on prayer, a little Carmelite explanation in our podcast, the Poco Poco podcast. We've been working through it. It's been maybe the most helpful thing for my spiritual life in the last year. One of the staples of the writings of St. Teresa of Ávila on prayer, St. Teresa of Ávila was a Carmelite saint who lived a few centuries ago, was this understanding of growing in prayer using the image of interior mansions. And basically, again, speaking very briefly as a Franciscan about Carmelite prayer, there's just these different levels of intimacy with the Lord, of going sort of deeper within and closer to the Lord, who resides ultimately at the most interior of mansions. And that as you grow closer to the Lord, for Saint Teresa, in her experience and her understanding, there are distinctive characteristics, experiences consistent with these different mansions, these different levels of growth, of intimacy and union to the Lord. And these include sort of levels of holiness, relationship to suffering, experiences of prayer, of infused contemplation. She goes on to talk about ecstasies. For us, I think it's helpful just to know this exists. I think there's two points that I'd like to make, two observations. One of the distinctions that develop as you grow in prayer, according to St. Teresa of Ávila, is she talks about the ways in which the soul sort of recedes from the Lord. And she uses the image of the ways in which one might water a garden. And I think there's a lot of hope in this. There's a lot of good news in this, and there's a lot of encouragement in this image. And she talks about you can water the garden through just doing really hard work. You have your garden, you have your pail, you take your pail, you go to the water, fill up the pail, come back, pour the water in the garden, go do it again. And it ends up, as time goes on, it does end up certainly watering the garden, growth happens. But it's tedious, it's slow, it takes a lot of work, it's laborious, etc. And these are going to be consistent with sort of the earlier experiences of growth in the spiritual life. Particularly, I think an image would be that early on in prayer, there's a good amount of human effort of meditation involved with prayer, and of asking questions, and of piercing the mysteries, and of sitting and of persevering, etc. in the Lord's presence in this communion, right? But it can be felt as laborious sometimes, right? Praying for 15 minutes or 20 minutes or making a holy hour, it might feel difficult. Praying a rosary might feel difficult. These are kind of expressions of kind of somewhat being early in the spiritual life. The second is this, as she talks about, you can also water a garden through irrigation. And this isn't the image she uses, but just think about you can have a sprinkler system, or you can have sort of troughs of water, and it comes from the river maybe, and it hits these different sort of aqueducts, and it comes and it overflows and it waters the garden. And there's a good amount of work done in setting up the system, but after that, it works pretty smoothly, right? And it waters the garden. And there's some effort, there's some maintenance, there's some watching of it. But for the most part, it's a much greater improvement, both of efficiency and level of effort to that first stage of kind of the bucket method. And the last is this, and the last is quite beautiful. It's the last way in which a garden can be watered is just through the rain. Right? And for the farmer, for the gardener, there's just no effort at all, right? It's just the water falls and it waters the whole garden. And that as one really progresses in prayer, really progresses in the spiritual life, there's this radical sort of infusion of the divine life, of infusion in prayer. And there's not a whole lot of effort in prayer. There's still a good amount of effort in dying to yourself and carrying the cross. But in the space of prayer, just not a ton of effort, right? So why is this good news? Because if prayer is a struggle, first of all, it's good news that you're struggling to pray. like that's the right struggle to be in, struggle to persevere, struggle to be faithful. But also, like, I think it's good news that it gets easier and more beautiful and more abundant as we progress, and that these little offerings, these deaths to ourselves early on, this work that we're doing early on, like, it will bear fruit through the gift of like infused contemplation. It will bear fruit in receiving from the Lord in such a beautiful way, as the water is gardened through irrigation and aqueducts, and ultimately in the highest levels of sanctity through rain. I think it's like, hey, just stick with it. I think one of the gifts of St. Teresa's understanding and teaching on prayer, and one of the reasons she's doctor of the church, is it's filled with a lot of hope. Like, hey, we just got to pray. Like, we have to persevere. And the hardest part, in many ways, with prayer and developing that is at the beginning. Okay. Second thing is this: like, Saint Teresa is talking about prayer from her experience, and so when she's talking about infused contemplation with this radical receptivity of God, in which He reveals Himself to us, in which He pours out His own life and fills us with faith, hope, and charity, like that she experienced that, and she saw that experience in many other people, including many of the sisters in her convent. And she talks about being like totally united to Jesus in the highest levels of the mansions, the deepest recesses of sanctity. That's a real thing. And it's such a gift and such a proof and such a witness to the reality and the depth and the goodness that can be found in intimacy with the Lord and in cultivating a profound interior life. And so, like, we got to keep this before us as the struggle's real, as the cross is heavy, as the temptations and the shiny things and the worldly ambitions are all around us. Like, let's stay focused on the Lord, and let's remember, like, as St. Paul talks about, like, eye hasn't seen, ear hasn't heard, it hasn't even dawned on man what God has prepared for those who love Him. And St. Teresa experienced a little bit of that on earth. And this is for you, and this is for me. And so, my friends, like, let's take prayer serious. Let's take prayer serious. Let's really go for it. Let's beg the Lord for help. Let's persevere. Let's simplify our lives. Let's grow in holiness with the hope that intimacy and union and communion with the Lord are for you and for me. And this is kind of a challenging and beautiful couple of quotes from Father Dubé. These are a beautiful couple of quotes from Father Dubé. Number one is this, talking about his book, Fire Within. A book on advanced prayer is a book on advanced joy. It is a love story about being loved and loving totally, like prayer, following the Lord. It's a love story, and it's about an abundant and deep life of prayer, but also like abundant joy, the fruit of loving abundantly and being loved abundantly. And then there's this last one is, if people today or in any age lack mystical prayer, it's not because it has been tried and found lacking. It is the gospel that has not been tried. Like, let's go for it. Let's be the ones who take the Lord at His word, take the gospel at its word, who cast out into the deep, who pray well, who die to ourselves, and who really, really, through the Lord's grace, sort of climb the mountain of the Lord and receive and drink deeply from the fountain of love and goodness and mercy, which flow from His Sacred Heart. All right, everybody, thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. Praying that you pray well. Please pray for me that I may pray well. And I look forward to being with you again next week. Remember, we are pilgrims on this earth. Somos peregrinos poco a poco, little by little. Vamos a llegar. We're going to make it. God bless y'all.